they think about cloud and assessing cloud. We're going to talk primarily around public cloud here, although many of the things that we'll discuss are applicable to private cloud also. So I hope you'll enjoy the presentation. It shouldn't actually take, I know our time slot here was, I think, for an hour, but you know, we created this presentation to take about 25 minutes, and so hopefully we'll do that. And then if we have time at the end, I'll unmute everyone and certainly answer any questions that you may have around it. So the first is a little bit about myself. For those who may not know me, my name is Jeremy. I am one of the analysts here. I'm actually the chief analyst at risk. I'm also the product manager for my IT assessment. I have a pretty extensive background in infrastructure work. I have a CCIE in voice, and have been working obviously in the assessment field exclusively for the last 6 years, doing and participating in probably over 400 plus a year. We're averaging a little over 1,000 assessments a year right now as our organization. So a lot of experience in enterprise customers as they deal with some of the challenges that we'll talk about today. These are some of the customers that we do assessments for. And again, the main thing I'm stressing here is not our customer list, but that these are enterprise customers. So there's a completely different conversation around cloud, especially public cloud, when you're dealing with a small business. Small business customers have such a price leverage within a cloud environment that they're willing to have some trade-offs, okay? And as we talk through the assessment, you'll see that where some of those trade-offs come, but they're not evaluating cloud from the same perspective in many cases as an enterprise customer might be evaluating it. So most of our experience comes in the enterprise space, and that's what we'll focus on today. If we look at assessments in general, the type of assessment that we're talking about here, a cloud assessment, fits in this stage of an IT lifecycle. There's a lot of IT lifecycle process flows that people propose. There's PPDIOO from Cisco, and a lot of other vendors have their own. You have an ITIL kind of look at creating service books and taking them through a lifecycle. We prefer to take one step back from that and really understand that we've got a couple of different phases that are happening. And we may have 15 different projects at a client that sit in these different stages, where we have strategy, planning, design, and execution, and they may all be at a different stage. What we talk about as an assessment, though, is something that's occurring, and it's a technical assessment. It's not assessing a customer's people. Are your people ready to go to cloud? That's for a different discussion than what we would have any insight on. But what we're talking about is a technical level assessment, and it's happening in an environment that we're already executing something. So it's not, again, a greenfield environment. And that's why, as I mentioned previously, the small business conversation is a little bit different, because there you may be dealing with a greenfield. We want to launch a new application, and we essentially just want to give it a try. So, okay, Amazon AWS is very attractive to us. We can throw it up there and get it going, but we're not currently executing that in-house. So most of the stuff that we're talking about is this tactical analytics between execution and strategy. So I'm already doing something. Could I use cloud to do it better? Could I save money? And how good of a fit am I for cloud? And then obviously, will cloud work for me, which is the last piece of it. So as I mentioned there's two kind of pieces to that as we interface with enterprise customers. Again, we're talking about public cloud here when I talk about cloud, but this doesn't mean that this is not applied to private cloud and or hybrid cloud environments either, where we have really, if you look at the bottom level there, the first set of questions, is this feasible and what is the cost? then, how well will it work, and how can we make sure that things are working, right? How can we make sure that as we change to a cloud environment, we're getting at least the same level of service that we had previously? We saw those as the main questions we got asked. What we try to do is then figure out what are they actually trying to ask, right? The customer's asking, how well will it work? How is it going to be better? What they're really asking is, how can I improve my odds of success, right? Tell me what I should expect that, and what I can do to make sure that everything goes better when we're in that. And then also, how do I make sure that I should even be going down this road? Is this even a fit for me? And ultimately, those roll up into strategy and tactics, right? Understanding, should I be going down this road, and then how do I go down that road? So this is what we believe is a framework that can help with those questions. And for us, this is a framework. We clearly, as an organization and as a company, have products that fit into these. But I'm not going to talk about those products today. That's not why we were asked to present at CalCon 2013, and that's not what I want to do with you guys today. I want to talk about it as a framework, and then you can kind of fill in. There's lots of ways to get from A to B. There's tools, there's existing information the customer may have, etc. So I'm not going to talk about product-specific stuff from us. I'm just going to talk about the framework. Phase one of any of this cloud fit discussion and even cloud assurance is to understand what we would be putting into a cloud. Now, when I'm talking about cloud, I'm going to talk about infrastructure as a service primarily. This is also obviously applicable for things like platform as a service. It's not really applicable for software as a service. That's going to be a different thing. But I think that this can fall and really encompass both infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, although we originally designed the framework for infrastructure as a service. So what we want to do in phase one is create a profile, understand what it is we're talking about doing. So each application profile would have a collection of what we call instances. And an instance is, if you think about public cloud here, we're really talking about something like an EC2 instance from Amazon. Understanding how many of those instances actually fit into our application profile, how many dependent applications are there, etc. As well as understanding some network component. Network is a huge piece that's missing right now from a lot of cloud discussions, unless you're doing those discussions, for example, with Cisco, where they understand that. If we're going to talk cloud, we better be talking network. And I have to say, SDN doesn't solve that. Just saying I have SDN doesn't mean anything. That doesn't solve any of the real challenges around network, which I'll show you as we go through this presentation. The next stage is once we've determined that, and from a deliverable standpoint, what you want to have there is profile information for an application, and as you can see, independent applications. So you want to know what's related to this application, what does it look like, what are its usage metrics, how much do we need to put, for example, into a cloud environment. And so, as I mentioned, there's lots of ways to get at that information. You can use an assessment like ours, or you can use other tools to get that. The second phase is the test network readiness, okay? Where are we moving these apps if we're going into a cloud? It may be that we're staying within the same data center. We're just kind of switching from we used to just have a bunch of HP servers running VMware, and now we're moving to a UCS platform, and we're going to do some director, and we're going to have a lot more automation and those types of things. And so in that case, the network profile test is still important, but may not be as big of a deal. But if we're moving it to a separate location, or we're putting it into a public cloud, then it becomes a much bigger issue to make sure that what we expect from a network profile, like flow size and characteristics that we did in phase one, is maintained. So what are we really concerned with there? Packet loss rates, TCP round trip times, the things that make an application responsive. How is that going to change as we move into a different environment? And then the third level is to actually validate that. So what we're going to do there is do some component level performance validation for our profile, our instances. All right. How do we make sure that if we're working with a customer, they don't all of a sudden say, well, it worked better before than it does now, or this is a problem, there's a problem with the cloud. Many of our partners, and some who may be on the presentation today, offer a cloud service, right, a private or hybrid cloud offering. So you may have run into that if you've gotten a good number of customers on there where they say, well, it worked better than it does now before. And so if we haven't done phase 1, then we can't do phase 3 and say back to a customer, well, all these things are the same or better, right? If we have component level validation that we're doing as well as we were before or better, and we have the network testing going on, then we can say to them, you know, the metrics show that these are better, so we now perhaps need to look up in the application level, okay? So if we look again at that application profile, we're talking about feasibility on the right-hand side and cost along the bottom. And feasibility on the right-hand side of the network, we're leaving security out of this. I'm not going to talk about security as part of this. That's a whole separate discussion. For, you know, there's not much you're going to assess about a customer as far as understanding their tolerance for security in the cloud. You're going to basically ask them, is the data that's here, are we okay to put it over here? And they're going to have an opinion on that. The assessment or any kind of assessment you do at a technology level is not going to make too much of a difference there. I will say that security concerns over cloud, I think, are a little overblown right now. However, you know, customers tend to have strong opinions on those. So what we're looking at here from a feasibility standpoint is actually, are we going to be able to forklift this network change up, okay? Or do we just have too many connections that have to remain here, right? Are we going to be able to move dependent applications into the cloud also, or is that going to complicate it too much, okay? So that's really where we're looking at feasibility. And then cost, which I'll show you an example of, is really defined by what we need to create as an instance. Okay? All right, so cloud fit or feasibility. And this is where we look again at that network side. Really what we want to understand is how do we access the app? Is it HTTP, HTTPS? Okay. Does it have communication to other servers? So obviously if it's not HTTP, if it's a fat client application and I have, you know, it's our old point of sale app and it has some sort of telnet connection, okay, that's not encrypted, then that's going to be a problem moving that to the cloud. Right? We're going to have some challenges there. So do we have some very, very portable, easily deployed communication methods to the application itself, to the instance? Then what is it doing with other servers? So what infrastructure resources is it accessing that we don't realize? DNS, you know, LDAP servers. And ultimately, what is that client usage profile? And what are their performance requirements? Because what are we going to be able to get those performance requirements out of a cloud environment or the transit network to a cloud environment? A good example of that, just as a side note, is currently organizations invest heavily in their MPLS WANs, let's say, and I'm accessing this application over what is a fairly controlled environment of that MPLS WAN. And, you know, we could have all sorts of other presentations about how controlled is fairly controlled. But it's likely going to be a little more controlled than the Internet. So at a branch location, I may have a fairly solid MPLS connection, and then I have a DSL connection. So for Internet at that site. But if we move this app to the cloud, are we now accessing that over the DSL connection, or are we still going to bring that backhaul the MPLS and out the Internet? So these are choices that a customer has to make. And what they really need to be able to do is say, how much will we be putting on that DSL, and potentially, again, even test that DSL to make sure that it's valid as far as a phase 2 step. or that it's going to provide the level of service. I don't know if you guys are able to hear me. I guess I'm sorry. I apologize. Steve just sent me a thing that my audio cut out. Sorry about that, Steve. I didn't see that until now. Oh, no. Then Steve says, no, on his end. Okay, great. Okay, so this is an example of an application performance, or an application, sorry, dependency mapping. This is based on one of our assessments, what we would do on our back end, and then provide, obviously, a little bit more formatted piece out to customers and partners. But this gives you an idea of what we're looking at from a data perspective, right? How many different types of communication and what different types of protocols are we using to communicate between any given host, so that we can say what, not just what is the primary communication stream, in other words, where do I connect, but if I connect to another server that is then dependent on another server for something like DNS, making sure I understand how far those dependencies go out, what those dependencies are, so that I can replicate those servers and those services successfully in my cloud environment. So you'll want to make sure you do this. Again, there's lots of ways to get this data. There are a lot of applications that you can use to get here. This is just an example of ours. Then let's look at Cloud Fit. And I'm going to use Amazon here. We use Amazon for a lot of our infrastructure, so I'll use Amazon. And again, I told you guys we'd focus on public cloud here. Let's talk about that Cloud Fit from a cost perspective. So cost is obviously a huge motivator for cloud. Everyone says, oh, well, the cost is so much less. So let's do a quick model and see. I picked Amazon EC2s. And what you'll notice that they define three, they actually are a few more, but I just picked these three. And they essentially double in cost each time you move up. So when I go from small to medium and then medium to large, which means that a large is 4 times what a small is. But what you'll see is they define it as certain things like a compute unit. All right, and we don't know what that means. Amazon doesn't really define that. And these are part of the challenges of public cloud and why a lot of customers may want to go private cloud. So if you show customers some of this information, for example, that may help them realize, well, I want to think more about private cloud because these variables are more than I can take on. So you can see there what Amazon defines a compute unit as. It's about a 1 gigahertz Opteron processor. Okay. Now, as you can also see, Amazon does not state what moderate or low network performance means. It's not defined anywhere. So, that is probably because it's a combination of things like the CPU resources for the underlying hypervisor for wherever your EC2 is, right? How many hops you are away from the edge of Amazon's network. So there is a lot of challenges there, including, for example, the standardization of those systems. But there's a lot of ambiguity within that. Now, does it make a difference, I guess, is the question, right? So we did an example, and this is what we presented at CloudCon, and this is something that we've done some research on. First, you have to make an assumption of the total cost of ownership of a physical server. Now, there's a lot of places that we can gather that data from. We picked the one you see there. Again, it doesn't really matter. Any of those will work because what we're really concerned about is what is below it. That's about $4,950 a year per server. So you can figure $5,000 per server is your total cost of ownership on top of the capital expense, right? Then what we did was from one of our assessments, we took a real-life health insurance payments code. And this is what they had. They had 9 physical VMware hosts. They had 88 VMs running on those. So if you really take the fact that they had 9 physicals, they're looking at $45,000 in total cost of ownership for those servers. okay, because it's 5,000 times 9. That's what they have. They actually only have 9 physical servers. If you convert all of those to an EC2, and you convert them based on their configured resources, so what you have in VMware, you replicate into EC2, the total runtime cost for that customer this year is going to be $240,000. It's a significantly more expensive proposition to run this same environment in a public cloud if you do it based on how it's set up in their current environment. In this model, what we decided to do was run the same model. Again, whether they're $45,000 a year or, you know, you could triple their total cost of ownership to $135,000 a year, and you'd still be on parity. You'd still be less than the original Amazon model. This model we did differently. We actually built it based on performance. So rather than looking at what you have configured for your ESX environment or what do you have allocated to each of these individual VMs from a share perspective, instead we said, what are you using? And you can see the breakout of what they needed based on 95th percentile utilization was dramatically different. Based on usage, they only needed 22 large instances. Based on their config, they had 63. Okay? And you can see that the total runtime cost is almost half. So if you properly assess this customer, let's say that they would just say, we want to go to Amazon or public cloud or any cloud environment. We want to forklift this off somewhere else, even if it's your private cloud. If you're doing it based on what they currently have configured, you're looking at twice the cost of what they actually need. What they need, based on what they're using, would only cost them $133,000. However, it's still more expensive. Now, there's some other things that go into that with the ease of use, right? Their current environment isn't a cloud, so it doesn't have a lot of self-service. It doesn't have some of those additional things. And really, at that point, you're talking to a customer about the premium of price they're willing to pay for those things. But it's a very interesting thing to see the difference between a pricing model based on assets and one based on performance. Okay, so let's talk cloud success. Let's say we've decided, though, that we're going to do that. We're going to move at least some of these into an infrastructure as a service or even platform as a service. So now what we need to do is test this, okay? And so we want to test, as you can see, I was focused at this presentation on infrastructure as a service. You want to test it against previous benchmarks so that you can see what the difference is, what is the problem. And then you want to be able to look at some very specific metrics, which I'm going to show you in just a moment why that's a challenge currently. This is an area that we're really looking to public cloud providers. They have to get much better about. And you must be able to simulate into this cloud environment. Okay, so you've got to be able, as I gave you that example, if we're going to move the clients, the application of our branch A is connecting to, we're going to move that into the cloud, that we need to be able to test from branch A to the cloud, okay, whatever path we're taking. These are some of the challenges we have with this. And the main is that we have really insufficient monitoring metrics for cloud compute units, right? These are the individual servers. And I'm going to show you in just a moment what some of those statistics are. I think I have it on the next slide. It makes it kind of challenging. And unless we had VMware and Hyper-V, or, you know, pick your hypervisor of choice, if we hadn't had many years now of doing those on our own as IT professionals, we might not realize all the things that happen under the hood that, hey, the fact that Amazon doesn't show us swap in, swap out rates, or they don't have CPU ready time metrics. those are a problem. We wouldn't realize that unless we had actually looked and seen it happening in our own kind of clouds that we're running with our own virtualization. Okay, and another big driver for private clouds is that you can get this information in a private cloud that you're controlling. You cannot get it in these public clouds. These three major metrics that we see a lot do not exist. So let me show you how big of a deal it is that I'm talking about. We see in our assessments CPU oversubscription, meaning the actual physical server is oversubscribed from a CPU perspective. So your VM that you're running there, and we're going to talk VMware for a moment. The virtual machine you're running in VMware wants to execute a command on the CPU, but it can't. And it can't do that because it can't get access to it because something else is using it. So it sits in what we call ready time, CPU ready time. And that increments. VMware tracks that for us, and it will tell you how much of that are you seeing. Now, VMware recommends that you don't have more than 5% CPU ready time. So we see that, though, go over 5% in 37% of customers. What that means is when you're looking at the individual VM, you don't see any CPU issue, but the performance is still bad. And unless you're tracking at the hypervisor level, you're not going to know that. Well, guess what? AWS and Rackspace, for example, as two public cloud providers, they don't provide that metric. You can't get that. So you don't know if you're experiencing that issue. Memory swap in, swap out rate, right? Swapping memory from the hypervisor to disk. That you don't see because it's been oversubscribed. Again, we see that 54% of customers today that have VMware, and you can't get that metric. The one that's really the most, I think, challenging for all of us, too, is this hypervisor packet loss. We see it in 46% of the customers we look at. This is packet loss that's not occurring on a network interface. It's occurring in this virtual switch world that sits in a hypervisor. And we see it in 46% of customers. But I can't get that metric from either AWS or Rackspace. So there's a lot of variables here that we don't get a chance to control or even monitor, which is why we have to be so diligent about the initial assessment and defining some of those parameters, tracking, doing packet capture at a host level, right, or at a passive packet level, so that we are not just relying, I should say, on network devices to tell us packet loss, but hey, let's look at the actual stream, because when we have packet loss in the AWS hypervisor or the Rackspace hypervisor, we're not going to be able to get that metric from them. We're going to have to watch it end to end, and we need a way to do that. So if you want to talk about cloud assurance, how do we make sure that those work? These are things that you have to think ahead on so that you have the original metric and you can compare it to the current metric. So what is the future of cloud assessments? This is still, anyone who tells you they figured out how to do cloud assessments hasn't done enough cloud assessments. That I can assure you. There are a lot of pieces to this. And, you know, from our standpoint as a technical side, that's where we're focused. And I don't feel, as you can see, I put in the thing, the tool, that's my shameless plug, use us. But the tool really doesn't matter, but the approach does. Okay? So whether you use our assessment platform or whether you use other applications, however you're doing it, I would encourage you to think back to that framework that we talked about, where let's spend the extra time to define these profiles, not just for feasibility and cost, but also to make sure that when we go into this environment, we can validate whether or not we're getting the expected performance. There are big questions still around all of that, you know, around performance and reliability in cloud environments. And especially the enterprise, the cost, as you guys could see in the model we gave you. Again, F&B is totally different, The capital expense for the SMB to spin up 10 servers is expensive compared to spinning up 10 EC2 units, but for an enterprise customer, moving existing infrastructure or decommissioning it into a cloud, the cost model is not so black and white. And depending on how they size their cloud, they may wind up spending a significantly larger amount of money on it. Okay? So there's still some big questions around performance and reliability, and not just security in those environments. Those still remain to be played out. We have to see how that goes, and I think that that's one of the reasons private cloud recently has really picked up a lot more steam, and that, you know, people are talking about hybrids and beginning to understand utility computing in the cloud versus what I really need to have is a controlled environment, not just from a security perspective, but even from a performance and reliability perspective for my mission-critical apps. So thank you very much for attending today's webinar. I am going to take everybody off mute, or attempt to. I don't use GoToMeeting that often, or GoToWebinar, so we'll see if I can. Let's see if I know how to do this. And then if anyone has questions, I would be happy to answer them. Oh, apparently I cannot unmute Liz or Chris for some reason. It says your audio pin has not been entered. So if you guys want to do that, I did, however, unmute Steve. So if anyone has questions, like I said, let me know. And obviously, if not, thank you very much for attending. We can always be reached via email. My email is jlittlejohn@risknetworks.com, and you can also email sales or info@risknetworks if you have any questions around how our products align to this framework. So.
John? Hello, John?
Yes.
Yeah, we've been having audio problems on our end. Is there any possible way, I see that's being recorded, can you send us a link to it so we can watch this over again with our entire sales team?
Sure, absolutely.
I'd appreciate it. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's been great.
Sure, great. Yeah, thank you. And thank you guys for attending today. And again, if there's anything else that we can do, please let us know.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day.
You too, sir.